everyone, my name is Fatima. I'm from the LUMUN training platform, and I'm going to go over the second part of my previous video that was on navigating dual delegate committees in a virtual setting. In this video, if you find this part of the video useful as well, then please do like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and stay tuned for our other videos on similar topics or on dual delegate settings as well.
Well, let's look at more specific ways of how to navigate double delegate committees online. It's important to sit down at least a week prior to the conference and have a good game plan established. This game plan should ensure that both dual delegates are on the same page in terms of things like perception, stance, who deals more with speeches, who deals more with unmods, whose strengths and weaknesses you need to be utilized at points in time, and other related things. Secondly, being on the same page, which ties in with what we talked about in the previous slide on communication. As long as you and your dual know what's happening in both the formal session and informal session at all times, you will be able to ensure that both duals are on the same page, and that is extremely important in terms of your perception within committee, because it will not seem disjointed when other people come up to talk to you, or when the dais members see you either speaking in your speeches or in your unmoderated caucuses, because both people will be putting out the same sort of stance or ideas on particular moderated caucuses or other issues, which is generally a huge issue that we see with performance in dual delegate committees, that people generally seem to have more of a disconnect in terms of how they put across their thoughts and what thoughts they put across. The third thing that you need to focus on, particularly in larger committees, which dual delegate committees generally tend to be, is to listen more than speaking. By that, I don't mean to say that you shouldn't speak at all, but I do mean to say that particularly in unmods, it would help if the person whoever is leading the unmod attempts to listen more to other people and then pitch in their thoughts rather than speaking up from the very beginning. This is generally a tip for any committee, not just dual delegate committees, but it applies more to larger dual delegate committees, because that is where the unmods become the sort of place where an echo chamber is created and everybody's speaking and nobody's listening. In those sorts of committees, it's very important to be that one rock who is silent until everybody has gotten a chance to speak and everybody's opinions are known and heard, and then they start to speak. This is generally also good in terms of putting out that image of being the calm, collected, and collaborative delegate who is always there to listen to everybody else and will generally positively impact your perception in line with things like the LUMUN spirit, right? The fourth thing that you need to focus on is that the idea of like the good cop, bad cop dynamic doesn't really work in dual delegate committees, particularly if you're going to, for instance, an international conference or the LUMUN conference, for instance, right? So the reason this is the case is because you cannot have any one member of the double delegate team come across as unfriendly or undiplomatic. However, we've seen this a lot in the past, like I've seen this a lot in the past in my committees, that one person in the dual tries to take a more hardline stance and the other person then comes in to show like more of an eased up stance to get people to agree with them more, or to get people to support them more, or believe like, or feel as if they are being heard by the good cop, so to speak. The reason this doesn't work is because while it may work in committee in terms of like getting support from the delegate base, it will not really work in your favor as far as the dais is concerned. And that again ties in with the concept of things like the LUMUN spirit, right? Because by putting out that bad cop image, what you're essentially doing is putting out the perception that you are not open to diplomacy, debate, or negotiations, or any compromises and concessions. And that entirely is going to put out a very bad image for you in terms of your performance as a delegate. Finally, when it comes to unmods, it's important that you know how to unmod efficiently. By that, I mean that spending time in Unmods in such a way that you garner support for yourself in the form of a block. You also ensure that everybody in said block feels heard at all points in time. And you also finally ensure that proper documentation is done by the end of the day, right? Generally speaking, it helps to switch up in a double delegate committee in Unmods rather than having the same person in the Unmod throughout the conference, because a change of pace generally helps people get to know both members of the dual pair, and that ensures that both members of the dual pair gain greater relevance within the committee rather than just one person gaining that greater relevance within committee. The issue with only one member of the dual pair gaining relevance in the committee is that it puts out the image to the chairs that only one person in the pair is actually doing any work of substance, which is problematic if you want that balance element to be maintained in terms of your performance, right? So ensuring that like an equal switching schedule of sorts is established between the pair is extremely important to ensure that your unmods are carried out more efficiently and that your performance in committee seems more refreshing rather than redundant, because there will be a constant change in the approaches of the different people that are being sent either into the unmod room or into the mod room virtually, that is. Finally, let's look at experience, right? I've already mentioned that a game plan is important, so I'm not going to be going into more detail about that or about the second point in terms of performance of both mattering. But when it comes to the third point, this again ties in with the idea of perception, but it's generally something that often goes ignored, because generally speaking, even within dual delegate committees, most people tend to forget that they are in this committee working as a team and not as an individual unit, right? As such, you should not be seen separately, rather you should be seen as a unit. From my experience from a double delegate committee back in LUMUN, I can think of a number of delegates that seemed either disjointed from their countered part, or other delegates that seemed very like joined quite literally at the hip with their other like counterpart, right? The difference between the two's performance and their like general perception within the committee was very obvious, because when you had people, when you had pairs that were seen separately rather than as a unit, you realize that they were facing a lot of perception issues in terms of the dice and were not in the end successful in that particular conference. The reason for this was exactly what I talked about before. For instance, only one person was mostly assigned to the unmods and the other person was mostly restrained to the moderated caucuses room. And that entirely was a problem because only one person was generally seen in the committee from that particular double delegate pair. Seen in the committee is doing any work of substance, right? So that one person was seen separately from their double delegate, which ended up becoming a problem for that particular pair by the end of the conference. Conversely, you had other pairs of double delegates who seemed to be on the same page at all times and had a very good balance in terms of who went and did unmods and who went and did moderated caucuses and so on and so forth, right? What they also did was that whenever one person would be making a particular point or mentioning a particular principle in a speech, that person's pair would make it a point to bring up those points and principles in the unmoderated caucus that was going on at the very same time. And this is why having a game plan really matters, because when you do that, when you plan out how you're going to perform in committee, what you do is you preempt what's going to be happening and what you're going to be saying within that committee, showing that both delegates are on the exact same level and the exact same page. And that is generally extremely important for double delegate committees. Obviously, you can't be entirely prepared for everything that's going to be happening in committee. For that purpose, the game plan isn't something that you can always stick to or should always stick to. Obviously, you do need to adapt to changing circumstances as they arise. However, having that sort of a template really does help in terms of showing the dais and the rest of the committee that both delegates in the pair know what's going on and know how to deal with it effectively. Finally, you have the point that says excel at everything instead of relying on your dual to excel at what you lack, right? This ties in with the second point in this particular side, where when we talked about previously the strengths and weaknesses aspect, we mentioned that if a person in that particular pair has any weaknesses, rather than those weaknesses being ignored or made up for by the other person in the pair, they should be countered and they should be managed in such a way that those weaknesses are practically insignificant by the time of the conference, right? A lot of people in double delegate committees become very complacent in terms of like going to either unmods or speeches, because they're like, oh, I'm not that good at unmods, but my double del is. So I'm going to be doing mainly speeches and they can pick up the slack in the unmods. That's a very problematic way to think, because instead of trying to fix your weakness, what you're doing is you're relying on your dual to again excel at what you lack. And that becomes starkly obvious to DIS members, particularly in a virtual setting, right? So just ensure that you train actively and you sit down with your double delegate well before the conference to ensure that both people know what the other person lacks and thus what the other person needs to be taught. Because just being complacent and ignoring where you fall short is not going to really help you win that award at the end of the day. Finally, staying in constant contact, I mentioned in the very start of the video, is so important that I cannot even begin to like talk about it more than I already have. However, the most ideal situation would be if you could be in the same like physical space as your double delegate, even if you are going to an online conference. I understand that that's not always possible, but if that is an option, it would be heavily advised to do so, because nothing beats like in-person communication, even if you're at an online conference. However, if being in the same physical space is not possible, then as I said before, establishing a constant communication stream, catching up between breaks to let the other person know what happened, what happened, where, at what time, and what significance that has for the rest of the developments and committees, etc. And then also having certain time periods in between that are set beforehand, where you check in with each other to let each other know if anything majorly important happened. And finally, again, having that one game plan prepared for yourself well beforehand is generally important, because even if you can't stay in contact as much as you would like to for any particular reason, if you had that one game plan, it'll be easier for you to predict what your dual delegate is going to be doing in any particular situation. So finally, that is the end of our video on how to navigate virtual double delegate committees. I hope this was of help. And for more information on unmoderated caucuses, generally double delegate committees and online MUNs, you can take a look at other similar videos on our YouTube channel. So yeah, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.